Let's turn our Bibles for our Sunday school hour to Genesis chapter 8. Genesis chapter 8, and we will be starting in verse number 20 of Genesis chapter 8. Last time we took a little journey, didn't we, on the ark, and we discovered that the windows of heaven were open, and the depths were opened up, and the water just poured in for 40 days and 40 nights. But that water has to drain, and so Noah and his family were on the ark for a little over a year's time. Now, if you were on a boat for over a year's time and had never set foot on dry land, what would you do? I remember when I went off to college, I'd never been anywhere really before in my life, and I was going 2 states over. I remember coming home and going to the old family cemetery and taking some dirt in my hand. It's like I'm back home. I've got my home dirt in my hand now. People think that's crazy, but I'd never been away from home really for such a long period of time. But what was the first thing that Noah did when he got off the ark, when his family got off the ark? And we see it here in chapter 8, verse 20. Someone suggested as I was studying for this that most people might have got out of the ark and just knelt down and actually kissed the ground, that they'd been so happy to be back on dry ground. But here's what Noah did. It says, "And Noah built an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar." Noah built an altar unto the Lord. After spending a little over a year on the ark, Noah's first response was to pay homage to his God, the God who had allowed him to survive this cataclysmic event. That was his first response. This is how God's people had been taught to honor and to please him, by giving sacrifices. You go all the way back to Adam and Eve in the garden, the animals that were killed in order that they might be clothed. You go back to Abel and Cain. Cain's sacrifice was not accepted. Abel's was accepted. Abel's sacrifice was a sacrifice from a good heart, and it was a sacrifice of what? An animal. That's right, of blood. And so we see here, Noah built an altar unto the Lord, and it says he took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl and offered burnt offerings on the altar. If you remember, there's a little bit of a differentiation there. Every animal came 2 by 2, male and female, except for the clean animals, the ones that could be sacrificed. And how many of them went onto the ark, according to our Bible? 7, that's right, 7. And so if you were that 7th animal, here you go. It's time for you to give your life. Now, there's a lot of clean animals out there, according to the Scriptures. And so what we see is this was a gigantic sacrifice. There were a lot of animals sacrificed, but guess what? Such a great salvation deserves such a great sacrifice. And so God is definitely worth it. We notice here, it says here that he offered what kind of offering on the altar? A burnt offering. You know what? Let's go to Leviticus chapter 1. As we look at the books of the law, sometimes we may get the false impression that, for instance, the 10 Commandments didn't go into effect until they were given on Mount Sinai. But that's just not the case. The 10 Commandments, in principle, were already there. And we know from Romans chapter 5 that sin and death existed before the law was brought into place. And so as we look at Leviticus chapter 1, we see the first offering, or the first sacrifice that's described here, and it is the burnt offering. And I believe we could probably take this offering here all the way back to Abel. And that was probably a burnt offering as well that he was giving. So it says here, Leviticus 1, verse 1, And the Lord called unto Moses and spake unto him out of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, If any man of you bring an offering unto the Lord, ye shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd and of the flock. If his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. And he shall kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood round about upon the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So we see here the example of the bullock. This is a larger offering. And so if you were offering this, what would happen is you would hold the head of that offering that you were giving as this animal was put to death. And then the blood of this animal would be collected, and it would be sprinkled on the altar, and then the animal would be burned up. That would be how this offering would go. And we see here in verse number 9, But his inwards and his legs shall he wash in water, and the priest shall burn all on the altar, to be a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire. And notice this phrase here, a what unto the Lord? A sweet savor. Or you might say here, a sweet aroma unto the Lord. Okay, just keep that in your mind. Verse 10, And if his offering be of the flocks, namely of the sheep or of the goats, for a burnt sacrifice, he shall bring it a male without blemish. And again, verse 13, But he shall wash the inwards and the legs with water, and the priest shall bring it all and burn it upon the altar. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, of a what unto the Lord? Sweet savor. Okay? And so we see here you could offer a bullock, which is, big animal. You could offer a sheep, which is kind of like a mid-sized animal. And verse number 14, And if the burnt sacrifice for his offering to the Lord be of the fowls, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves or young pigeons. And so we see here you could offer a big animal, a medium-sized animal, or a little tiny bird. So this was not a particular offering when it comes to the size of the animal. It was to be a male in these larger animals, but it wasn't a particular offering. And verse 17 says, And he shall cleave it with the wings thereof, but shall not divide it asunder. And the priest shall burn it upon the altar, upon the wood that is upon the fire. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, of a what unto the Lord? Of a sweet savor. And so we go back to Genesis chapter 8. And once again, these sacrifices didn't start when the law was given. They were already around. And especially as we see this burnt offering, we see here this is what Noah offered when he got off the ark. All kinds of animals can be offered on this. And this offering, and here's Scofield's note on this, typifies Christ offering himself without spot to God in delight to do his Father's will, even in death. And so, as this offering was given, I believe that Noah, by faith, could see that this is a picture of the seed of the woman who was spoken of in Genesis 3:15, who would one day be offered for the sins of humanity. And we see this here in Genesis 8, verse number 20. We see something else that's familiar in verse number 21 to what we read in Leviticus. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. So what do we notice here in that first line that's similar to Leviticus chapter 1 and the burnt offering? What do we notice? It is a what in the nostrils of God? Sweet savor. That's right. It's a sweet savor, a pleasing aroma in the nostrils of God. And this is a way of saying that the offering was acceptable to God, like Abel's offering was. It was acceptable to God. I remember when I was growing up that we would be driving down West Broad Street, and you knew you were getting near the Burger King. Because the Burger King, I don't know what they did. They must have had, they were grilled, what do you call them? Grilled burgers, whatever you call them. Flame broiled. That's it, flame broiled. And anyway, you would smell it as you went down West Broad Street. Back then, you probably have your windows open on a spring day or a summer day, and you could smell it. And in the nostrils of this little kid, that was a sweet aroma. Okay, a sweet aroma. You say, well, how can the burning of animals be a sweet aroma? Well, if you've ever been to a barbecue and you smell that pig in the cooker, that's a sweet aroma, right? It's not sweet in that it doesn't smell like chocolate chip cookies or smell like, something like that. But it is our cotton candy. But it's a sweet aroma. It's a pleasing aroma. And to God, it's not the smell of the meat that makes it pleasing, but it's the heart of the one who is offering the burnt offering. And so Noah's heart was right with God. He offers this burnt offering. He offers bullocks and sheep and birds, all kinds of animals in thanksgiving to God. Probably one of every one of those, and he had 7 kinds. And it's a pleasing aroma in the nostrils of God. He is pleased that when Noah was delivered from this cataclysmic judgment, that the first thing Noah did was to think of God and to offer an offering. So God makes a promise here in verse 21, part of what might be called the Noahic covenant. It says, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. Now, if you remember, there was a curse placed on the ground in Genesis 3, verses 17 through 19. He's not talking about that curse that was placed on the ground, where you had thorns and thistles, and people would have to work hard in order to make their crops grow. No, that's still around. But he explains here in this verse, neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. And so what he's saying is he would not curse the earth again by sending another worldwide flood. No more flood, right? That is his covenant. That is his promise to Noah and his descendants. And he admits something here. God admits something in verse number 21. He says, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. We notice here that the problem of humanity's sinful heart was not solved by the flood. However, as seen by the sacrifice in verse 20, atonement is available so that sinful humans can have a relationship with a holy God. Now, what does the word atonement mean in the Old Testament? A covering. A covering. And so we see here that this atonement can be made in the Old Testament. This covering of sin by putting your faith in the one who's the seed of the woman, the one who is pictured by these Old Testament sacrifices, this burnt offering, the one on whom you lay your hand, and is a picture of your sins being transferred to that animal, the one who is killed, the one whose blood is shed and sprinkled on the altar, the one who, like that burnt offering, is totally consumed as a sacrifice for my benefit and for your benefit. And so there is atonement. And I like what J. Vernon McGee one time said. He said, the saints in the Old Testament were saved by credit. And what he meant by that was, in the Old Testament, there was a covering for sin. But in the New Testament, when Jesus comes, sin is done away with. Sin is purged. Sin is gone, 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 gone. Yes, my sins are gone. That's New Testament Christianity. And so these Old Testament saints, as Noah was, their sins were covered because of their faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And one day, when Jesus came, those sins were purged because the sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice, which was typified by the Old Testament sacrifices, had been made. And so, yes, man is incurably sinful, incurably evil. But a way is made for man to have a right relationship with God. And that is through the sacrifice of the seed of the woman. And that is through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, which is pictured in the burnt offering and then in the other sacrifices as well. And so in verse 22, part of that Noahic covenant, while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. If you'd been through something like the Great Flood, you'd be thinking to yourself, when is the next one coming? And what God was saying to Noah and his children is, until this earth ends, there's going to be regular periods of planting and harvesting, cold weather, hot weather, and summer and winter, and day and night. Things are going to be normal as long as this earth remains. And after such a cataclysmic event, that would be a wonderful thing for God to tell you. Any comments or questions about the offering or about any of those things? All right, well, let's go to chapter number 9. Chapter number 9. We see, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. We see here that God has not rescinded his commandment from Genesis 1:28. Remember Genesis 1:28? And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. So, go forth, have lots of children, and fill up the earth with people, and have dominion over that earth. But something had changed. It says, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. And so I don't know what life was like before the flood, but it seems to indicate that the animals and people had a more friendly relationship before the flood. But now animals were given an instinct to where, like a deer, now, some people feed deer apples out of their hand and tame the deer, and, cats, cats are meant to be wild, hunters, and yet we tame them, and dogs are meant to just be running around eating the refuse. And these animals are not meant to be tamed, but human beings can tame them. But by nature, animals are afraid of humans. And the question then is, why should animals be afraid of humans? Well, that's in the next verse, verse number 3. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. When you see the word meat in the King James Version, it means food. And so every living thing that moves, and that is the animals, is now able to be food for you. And I think that it's assumed here that this means those things that are clean animals, not just any animal. And so, before the flood, I'm sure there were people who ate meat because meat is tasty. But it seems like before the flood, meat was not something that was normal for people to eat. And so good people would not eat meat before the flood. But after the flood, God is saying not only are you to eat the green herbs, not only to eat the fruit and vegetables, but these animals that are clean you can eat as well. And so, why did God put the fear of man into animals? Because man now is going to be able to eat animals. They're going to be hunted. Hunter and hunted come into play after the flood. Okay. But there was one thing, verse 4. But flesh with the life thereof, which is in the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. In other words, in verse number 4, people are not allowed to eat, or we might say drink, the blood of the animals. There's something special in the Bible about blood. And it says in Leviticus 17 that life is in the blood. And so, yes, you can eat the flesh of the animal, but you are to drain the blood. You're not to eat the blood of the animals. And so that's verse number 4. Now, in verses 5 and 6, we see that the first institution that God established back when he brought Eve to Adam was what? What's that institution called? Starts with an F. A. Family. That's right. Good. The first institution that God established was the family. We see in verses 5 and 6 God establishing a second institution. Let's read these verses. And surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it. At the hand of man. At the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. Killing a person made in the image of God is now, at this point, punishable by death penalty. And so, someone has to carry out this death penalty. And so, if you were to see a chart of the Bible up to this point, before the fall of man would be the age of innocence, because man had not partaken of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He was innocent. But then after he partook of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we have the age of conscience. The age of conscience. And we don't know much about the pre-flood world, but we do know that man has a conscience. And the conscience failed him. Because it says here, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Back before the flood, it said, every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And so if man was operating based on a conscience to control him, the conscience failed. And so we go from an age of innocence to the age of conscience to the age of human government. Surely, if we have a good government, then that can help people live righteously before God. And so we have this death penalty being instituted by God, and who is going to carry out this death penalty? Who is going to bear the sword? And that is the governments that people establish. Let's look at these governments. Romans chapter 13. Romans 13. So this is the second institution that God established. The first one is the family. The second one is the government. Romans 13, 1 through 4. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. The government beareth not the sword in vain. What does it mean to bear the sword? It means you have the right to administer justice. And part of administering justice is if someone commits murder, that person should be put to death. We see that in Exodus 21, right after the Ten Commandments are given. And this is true for both people and animals. If an animal takes the life of a human being, then that animal is to be put to death as well, because he has marred the image of God. Verse 12 of chapter 21 of Exodus, he that smiteth a man so that he die, he shall surely be put to death. And if a man lie in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar that he may die. He that smiteth his father or his mother shall be surely put to death. He that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. Even taking someone and selling him into slavery is worthy of the death penalty. And he that curseth his father or mother shall surely be put to death. Whoa. And if men strive together, and one smite another with a stone or with his fist, and he die not, but keepeth his bed, if he rise again and walk abroad upon his staff, then shall he that smote him be quit. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and shall cause him to be thoroughly healed. And if a man smite his servant or his maid with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall surely be punished. Notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his money. If men strive and hurt a woman with child, this is interesting, so that her fruit depart from her, yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him. He shall pay as the judges determine. And if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life. You strike a woman, she's pregnant, the child miscarries, the person who caused that child to miscarry is put to death. That's a very strong teaching in favor of the fact that the life within the womb is equal to the life outside the womb. Okay. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And if a man smite the eyes of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. And if he smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. Or if an ox gore a man or a woman, that they die, then the ox shall be surely stoned, and his flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall be quit. But if the ox were wont to push with his horn in time past, and it hath been testified to his owner, and he hath not kept him in, but that he killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and his owner also shall be put to death. You got a wild animal you can't control, and you haven't put that animal to death, you haven't taken care to make sure that animal can't get out, that animal gets out and hurts somebody, kills somebody, what happens to you? You get put to death. If there be laid on him a sum of money, then he shall give for the ransom of his life whatsoever is laid upon him. Whether he have gored a son or have gored a daughter, according to this judgment shall it be done unto him. And so, there's only one government that has ever been specifically inspired of God, breathed out by God, ordained of God in such a direct manner, and that is Israel. And in the government of Israel, God had the death penalty. Specifically, he had it, if you take a life, if you abuse the image of God, then your life will be taken. And so, we see the death penalty is established, and therefore a means by which the death penalty can be carried out. And then in verse number 7, this is where we'll end. And you, be ye fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly in the earth, and multiply therein. Once again, reiterating God's call, his command from chapter 9, verse 1, chapter 8, verse 17, and 128, to have many children, spread throughout the earth, and take dominion over the earth thereby.